Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back again. The next session is in English because our next speaker is from the United States again. To introduce our next speaker, a little anecdote. It won't take up more than 20 seconds. 5 years ago, Zeit Online, our news portal, turned 20 years old, and Jochen Wegner, he had an idea to bring 1,000 millennials together and have kind of a festival to celebrate the birthday. And I was part of the team. I'm based in Frankfurt. Jochen and his team sit in Berlin. And he said, "Hey Mark, do you use Slack?" And I asked him, "What's Slack?" That was in 2015. So I was a late adapter because Slack was actually founded by Stewart in 2013. The interesting thing is today we use Slack across the company, in Berlin, in Frankfurt, in Stuttgart, in Munich, everywhere. And of course we're not alone, and especially since the pandemic hit, Slack usage in Germany has increased. If the numbers I read in our fellow company paper Handelsblatt are correct, the revenues of Slack in Germany, in the German market, increased in the first half by 44%, paying clients by 81%, and 2/3 of all DAX companies actually use Slack these days. Sounds great, doesn't it? Exponential growth in the market in Germany. Well, things are not that easy. There are other products. One is Microsoft Teams. I'm sure Jochen and Stewart will talk about it. And the other thing is, don't forget, Slack is a company as well. They had to manage the pandemic. They had to do remote work. And Stewart, actually, I follow him on Twitter, and I read his tweets that he released and made public how Slack dealt with the pandemic as an organization itself. And he said, you know, Slack was not a remote work tool or a work remote tool. It's it's a tool for organization agility. And that shift that they had to manage was enormous. And in one tweet he wrote, "It felt like the shift from inboxes to channels, from email to channels, which we believe to be inevitable over 5 to 7 years, just got fast forwarded by 18 months. So this is what Slack had to cope with at the beginning of the pandemic. What the outlook of Slack will be in the world of the future of work while the pandemic keeps us busy. Stewart Butterfield, the founder, will now discuss with Jochen Wegner, my colleague in Berlin, editor-in-chief of Zeit Online. Over to Jochen and Stewart. Enjoy.
So Stewart is not only the founder of Slack, a company you know, and he's also something like an internet legend. We will talk about this later. I'm jumping to my first question again I had in the beginning, which was, you as a today American citizen, used to be a Canadian citizen before. As an American citizen, how was your night?
Well, to be clear, I'm still both, so I have the optionality, but obviously a very interesting night. I fell asleep around midnight and then woke up maybe 3 a.m. New York time, just in time to hear Trump come out and give the speech. I'm trying to think of what the right analogy is, but they're all very unpleasant. So yeah, to come out and give a speech saying not to trust the elections, halt the vote. He's mobilizing the tanks, and the soldiers will be coming soon, or something like that. And then fell back asleep and woke up, and it looks like it will resolve itself peacefully sometime, you know, in the next day or two. Obviously, a very exciting election.
So that's all you can say as a CEO in Silicon Valley today?
Oh no, I mean, I can say whatever I want. I mean, yeah, my hope was that Biden would win, and I think that will come true. It's disappointing to see that it wasn't a landslide, and it makes you wonder, had COVID not happened, or had Trump taken a more aggressive posture in the early days, he probably would have won, which it's a strange thing.
Would you describe yourself as a liberal? Maybe that's a strange question, but I'm German, so
I think definitely
confused about American politics from time to time.
Yeah, and I guess I don't know if The Economist is a bridge in political thinking, but capital L, liberal. I was in Canada, lowercase L liberal, like the traditional 19th century John Stuart Mill, history to the Enlightenment. Definitely a liberal in that sense.
Okay. So before we talk business for the rest of this, let me ask you something about your early life. So most people do not know that you grew up in a log cabin somewhere in Canada for the first, I think, 4 or 5 years. What do you still remember of this time? It's a very interesting way to grow up as a kid.
Yeah, it's I have very few memories because we left when I was about 5 years old, but pretty idyllic lifestyle. I think, other than there weren't very many other children around. There was one other child, and his name was Noah, and so I thought that Noah was the word for a child, not his name. There are so few of them. But very peaceful, growing vegetables in the garden, beautiful countryside. But my mother's father came from Poland to Canada between World War I and World War II. And he came to visit, and they had no electricity, no running water. They had a bathtub in the front yard. And he said, "This is why I escaped Poland, to give you this life." Disappointing, I think, for the previous generation.
And you started really early to teach yourself coding, right? So when exactly did you start writing your first lines of code?
Probably, I don't remember now if it was 1980 when I would have been 7 years old, or maybe 1981 when I was 8 years old, an Apple IIe. So kind of like the first computer to be mass produced and sold. And I had a real fascination with it. And I think the Steve Jobs line about it being a bicycle for the mind was quite true. But over the years, I kind of lost interest until I went to university in 1992 and discovered the internet. Since then, that's been the kind of fascination of my life, the use of computing technology to facilitate human interaction. And that can be the pre-web technologies, things like IRC and Usenet and email. It can be, all the way to today. You seem to have disparaging remarks about Instagram, but Instagram to Tinder to Twitter to the distribution of all of the world's media over the internet, the personal relationships that are formed there, the online communities. I mean, I think if you think back to the early 2000s, or for some people even earlier, like the mid 1990s, a lot of the idealism has been lost. I don't think anyone's quite as optimistic about it, but it's interesting what an integral part of our lives it is. And I would say you and I, and probably some of the people in the audience, are in the last generation of human beings that will know life both before and after the internet, because obviously it's something that will be with us until the heat death of the universe, or the sun swallows the earth, or something like that.
Yeah. So you are one of my heroes because you are the co-founder of Flickr. Nobody knows Flickr today. So if I would ask my kids what Flickr is, nobody knows. It used to be the Instagram of our days, of my early days. And it totally changed, for me at least, and I think for many other people, how we thought about the web and how we thought about communication and pictures and stuff like that. And I think to make it short, it never took off because you sold it to Yahoo, and somehow you missed the whole mobile train in a way. But the more interesting thing, if you look back today, you originally founded a gaming company to produce a game, and also and Flickr was just a feature maybe of the platform. And the same happened years later. Again, you founded another company and tried to produce a game, which was I was a user. It wasn't that successful, but there was this interesting feature you built for yourself for the communication of the team, which is Slack today.
Yeah.
So 2 times the same kind of strange serendipity that a feature of the original product became the main business. So what is it? What is that? Is this the normal way successful entrepreneurs in digital come into business? You just find something?
Yeah, I mean, I think being opportunistic is probably a common trait, and constantly looking for opportunities. Obviously, I am not at all in this category, not very athletic, but parkour, and people like the kind of gymnastics people do in urban environments. I think of entrepreneurialism as a little bit like that you have to keep moving. If you hesitate, you can really injure yourself. You have to be looking around the environment for opportunities to leverage or to exploit to keep the play going. But Flickr, the first game, the second game, Slack, to me, in some senses, they're all the same. They're all massively multiplayer game became massively multiplayer photo sharing, and massively multiplayer game became massively multiplayer workplace communication software. What they all have in common is people have an identity, and there's messaging, and there's a set of defined interactions you could have. And one of my favorite books, which, by the way, you can get from the 2 opening sentences, it's called Finite and Infinite Games. And it begins with, there are at least 2 kinds of games: finite games, which are played for the purpose of winning, and infinite games, which are played for the purpose of continuing the play. And so they're all kind of infinite games. Work is an infinite game in that sense.
Okay, but is it true that you wanted to give back the money to Excel, one of your early investors, and they convinced you to produce something else with the money, which is also a really strange story to hear, at least for a German.
Yeah, I think it's for them and for that class of investor, you give your money and you're confronted with a choice. Would you rather have 1/3 of your money back, or would you rather have one more lottery ticket? So I think to them, getting $0 back and getting 1/3 of their money back kind of counts as the same thing. If what they need is a hit. So one more chance of it being something successful is better for them. And that really, that worked out to, I don't know, $5 billion or something like that. So good choice on their part.
Okay, I think so too.
Yeah.
If we jump to now, so you in many interviews you stress the fact that a certain kind of playfulness is really important for a company, so for having new ideas and also for the communication with the user. How do you keep I don't know, how many people work at Slack today?
A little over 2,500.
Okay, so how do you keep them playing in these really strange, disembodied times?
It's an interesting question. So we're still struggling and still learning. And I think, like many companies, we've been probably surprised how well we've done in terms of productivity.
Same here.
Yeah. Happiness is a different question, because I think there's some people who had a very long commute, but they have a comfortable home and they like spending time with their family. So they're like, this is actually pretty great. And at the other end of the spectrum, schools still being closed in most of the places where we have offices, single parents are in an impossible situation. If they have to take care of their child and do the schooling all day, it's very difficult to work. Also, really young people, especially if they got a small apartment because they didn't intend to spend much time there, they cut off from their social life, which is work for many young people, and they're in an uncomfortable physical environment. And so there's some people who are really suffering, and some people who are happy, and then many who are in the middle. At the company level, as I said, we've been surprised by the degree of productivity, but I think I still have a concern that we're burning down social capital that we had accrued over the years prior. And at some point that reservoir goes dry, because in the old times, there was a lot of really weak social connections. And when I say weak, I don't mean bad. It's just acquaintances. And you would meet friends of friends or people in other departments. You would wait in line for the elevator or stand next to them at an all hands, or meet them at lunch or some kind of work event. And those relationships are very handy because it's someone in the engineering group who knows someone in accounting, and someone in finance who knows someone in sales. Now, 20% of our employees started after the pandemic. And instead of the 1 week they would have spent at headquarters meeting, a whole bunch of people, they have an online onboarding. And the team in charge of that has done a great job. I think, it's been very successful, and the people coming in fresh are happy, but they know many fewer people than they would otherwise. And obviously they know their manager, or they know their direct reports. They have the peers, the people that they work with most closely. But when I try to imagine what it's like for them, the rest of the company is just this like foggy, vague thing that's very difficult for them to discover. And I think maybe we'll be fine for another year or 2 years or 3 years. But I think at some point that runs out.
But isn't that the most interesting problem for a digital entrepreneur at the moment? How to recreate this kind of creativity and weak connections. So do you have any ideas how to do that?
Yeah, so we have quite a few. And I think there's also just an explosion of activity from other startups that are doing all kinds of interesting things. Many of which started before the pandemic. But I think the activity has increased, the pace has increased, the number of different companies has increased. And a lot of them have to do with communication, which is obviously what we do. The opportunities that we're paying most attention to are ones where you can take some processes that must be synchronous today, so generally meetings, and make them asynchronous, or where we can introduce more flexibility or less structure. Very familiar, I think, to almost everyone at this point, the Zoom fatigue and the experience of having call after call after call. And it's really interesting. There's someone who I put in that category of they don't have to do their long commute anymore, and they have a comfortable house and they like their family. I was talking to him in a meeting, and he said, yeah, it's 2 p.m. And he says, I haven't had a chance to have lunch today. Because he's so busy in his own house that he didn't, and I find it was, I had to make a real effort to put multiple bottles of water by my desk, or else I would get dehydrated during the day. And it makes no sense. So if we can take 10, 20, 30% of the time that people have to spend in synchronous meetings and make that asynchronous, I think that's a huge win. And just to be explicit, part of that is short video updates. There's 2 things that were valuable we found so far in our internal testing. One is they tend to be shorter. If you have many people have what they call a daily stand-up meeting. And so everyone on the team kind of goes around the room and they say what they're working on, how it's going, if they have any updates or questions for people. And if that lasts 15 minutes, many of the individuals will only have like 3 minutes of useful participation. They don't have that much to say, and most of what the other people are saying doesn't matter that much, and maybe something does. If they can record a short video and you can watch it when it's convenient for you, it shifts the dynamic quite a bit. It frees up people, gives them more flexibility. And I think flexibility is especially important now, specifically, not because of distributed work, but because of the other challenges of the pandemic, the childcare and the other responsibilities people have, and the kind of the lack of the amenities of normal life. The second one is, though, and I'm not really sure why this is, it can be delightful to see someone in that context, whereas you're sick of seeing them in the meeting. And that could be because it's not live. You can pause it at any time and walk away and come back. So you have more power or agency in it. You're not on camera, so you can be doing whatever you want. You can pick your nose and be looking at this update. But for some reason, it has a very different emotional tenor or flavor to it. So that's one area. The other one is synchronous in the sense that people are talking at the same time, but very unstructured, very ad hoc. And that's, I should back up maybe just for a second. Most people are probably familiar with Slack, but the very quick description is it's a channel-based messaging platform. So, like WhatsApp or iMessage or Facebook Messenger or whatever, but it's used for organizations, and they create a channel for everything that's important for them. That could be every customer, every topic. A lot of the US media, or most of the US media, uses Slack. So many of them had channels for every state, and then channels for every county in the battleground state, so they could keep up to date. the attention gets aggregated into the system that in the ideal case kind of mirrors the priorities of the organization because of this structure of the channels. So anyway, it's not a big innovation, but we created the ability, or maybe the better way to say it is, changed what it means to call someone. So the call doesn't start and then stop. It's always on, and you can enter and leave whenever you want. So
this is the best feature we are waiting for all the time. So something like a push-to-talk functionality would be super helpful, especially for newsrooms.
Yeah, for newsrooms, and for us, let's see. Last Friday was the close of our quarter, and every quarter, in a sales-driven business, there's all of these deals coming in, all these contracts, and we have to check and see if they're signed, and legal forms and all that stuff. So the sales operations team and the sales leadership and finance and legal and accounting have this mad scramble, and it usually lasts until very late in the night. And so they use this, and the difference is, there could be no one there. I enter. And my speaker is on, and I'm just doing my work. And then if someone else enters and they say something, I'll hear it. And it's most useful for teams that are working together closely. So the newsroom, the people closing the quarter, but just a group of marketers working on the launch of a new website, or software engineers working together in their daily work. The meeting can happen at any time, and it can last for 4 minutes instead of being scheduled on the calendar and people having to wait until that point and then feeling kind of obliged to fill up the whole 30 minutes. So that's been really, really successful. And in the best case, I think it recreates some of the serendipity and spontaneity of office conversations where, you're 2 desks over from me. So I call out and ask you a question, Jochen, and everyone can overhear, they can overhear the answer. And that's something that you can't get. So those are areas that we're focused, but of course there's a million startups, and I think that we will end up with a much more powerful set of tools on the other side of this that will be just as valuable when we're out of the pandemic as they are when we're in it. But I think we needed this crisis to push the innovation forward.
You didn't solve I love all the features you mentioned, and we are desperately waiting for them. But the one core problem you mentioned yourself in the beginning, which is we have all these new people, and how do they get to know? How do they have these weak bonds with other people? And also another problem would be the most interesting projects and ideas we at least have as an organization. They happen while walking through the newsroom. You meet someone. You don't work really closely together, but you walk to the coffee machine, and while walking there, you have a great idea by talking to each other. It's just impossible to simulate that. So at least for me, I can't imagine how we recreate the newsroom or a company on Slack or on other platforms. Any idea?
Yeah, there's people who are much more focused on unfortunately, the name of the company is escaping me. Maybe it'll come to me. But much more focused on different types of what they call presence. So how you show up to other people, and not literally trying to create the layout of the specific office that you left, but trying to situate all of the people in a space so that there can be those random combinations, and you can, you finish some task, you finish writing the message you're working on, or whatever it is, and you see that there are other people available, or you see that there are other people conversing, and you're able to just join that conversation. Now, obviously, we have to learn. Let me put it a different way. It may be less valuable, or kind of an impoverished version of what we have in real life. On the other hand, it could be better, but either way, we still have to figure out how to make use of those tools, because there's so much etiquette that we've internalized from when we were small children about when it's appropriate to interrupt someone, or if there are 2 people who are talking, from their body language, you can tell whether it's okay for you to join that conversation or not. And, without all of those cues, we need to invent new cues and new kind of social etiquette. And I'm pretty confident that'll happen. In most online communities, going back to Flickr, but even a decade prior, people did invent their own sorts of etiquette and their own social conventions with a very, very limited set of tools. And now we have much more powerful tools. So at least in theory, I think we should be able to find something that isn't a poor replacement for something we did in the regular world, but is an entirely new way of employing new technology that may not satisfy everything we had in the old world, but it gives us some new things.
So since you are working in a really competitive environment in Silicon Valley, you almost were forced to allow people to work also in the future wherever they want. So everyone's allowing everyone to work everywhere. So Microsoft tells you, you can go to China, Jochen, it's no problem. You just have to get the Chinese salary there and it's fine. Work from there if you really want that. And so in this environment, what do you think? At one point in time, it will be safe to come back to the office also for your people. How will you change the architecture of Slack? So the physical space, how will that change after the pandemic with the new environment?
It's a big challenge for us and for everyone, I think, because often these are decisions that have to be made several years in advance. When we, our headquarters in San Francisco, and I think it's probably around half of our employees are in San Francisco, and the other half were in 15 different offices in 9 other countries. But when we signed the lease for that, we thought, we're never going to fill this building. By the time we actually got the building and had finished construction, we had too many people. So we had filled it. So it's that kind of challenge. But here's how we see it today. Probably around 25% of people are going to want to be permanently remote. And when I say permanently, I don't mean they might move back to a city. They might end up working in an office many days a week at some point, but they're currently living where there is no office. They're somewhere else. But then we look at what we had before. We looked at the statistics, and in an average day, about 65% of the desks were accounted for. About 65% of the people who were assigned to that office actually came in. So some of them are on holidays, some of them are traveling for business, some of them are sick, whatever the reason is. So if you take away a quarter, and you think that you only needed 65% before, so now you're down to the 40s, maybe 45%. The other thing, the overwhelming preference that has been expressed so far is people's desire for flexibility. And we started a new kind of consortium think tank called Future Forum to look at some of these questions. One of the early survey results was about 12% of people want to come back to an office full time. Now, I think most people want to come back to an office sometimes. But if it can be 1 or 2 days a week, it's very different, or if it's maybe 3 days every other week. And we can imagine people getting together for the planning, the brainstorming, the creative or strategic work, kind of mapping out what they're going to do. But instead of, as they did in the old days, going to sit down, almost like a factory farm, like at their desk with headphones on, typing on their computer, not talking to anyone, they could do that part anywhere. So the office that we imagine for the future is probably at any given point around 20% of the people who would be assigned to that area. It's a tiny percentage that would actually be working at a desk there, but maybe 5% or something like that. Other people, I think, would work from home or perhaps from co-working spaces that are more convenient for them to get to. And we'll end up with a lot more what we call phone booths. So, very small rooms for one person, because if you're joining a lot of meetings, it's horrible to be the one person who's remote and then 7 people are in the conference room, because you just can't hear them. Yeah. So everyone gets their own little square in Zoom. But also that means a lot more creative space, a lot more flexible space, more like a nice hotel lobby or a social club or something like that than an office. And, like I said, we have to make those bets now, and we could turn out to be totally wrong, but people are moving already. This crisis caused a lot of different life decisions. So some people want to be closer to their family. Some people want to live where they can see a lake or a mountain or something like that, not live in the city anymore. Many people said, Well, if I don't have to commute, then I can move an hour further away from the city center and get a much bigger house, and my kids can go outside and, more pleasant. But now I would have a 2.5 hour commute if I were to go to the office every day. And that's impossible. But, 2 days every other week, I could probably do that. And when those decisions are made, when we get a vaccine or we find a treatment or whatever it is, we can't insist that those people move again with their families. That's the situation we're in. So I think we will end up with something like a seat or a desk or a chair for about a quarter of the people, but in a totally different environment that's more there to facilitate social activities and creative activities and group meetings and a tiny bit of very solo activity. But most of the lowest value purpose of the office, I think, will be distributed. It's very Silicon Valley to say it this way, but we think about it as unbundling the office, because the office exists as a projection of power. We have our logo on the side. Yeah. It's a cultural touchstone, a place to host customers. There's all these different purposes it has. And the one that's least valuable, I think, is that factory farm kind of desking row after row for people to sit and use their computers.
I have another architecture question. How will the post-pandemic world change the architecture of our societies? So how will this transform the whole society? Do you have any idea?
So I'm in the same position of speculating. So here's some of the things I've been thinking about, and I don't have a deep conviction that these are accurate. But if there is a move away from the requirement for people to come into the office, you get two things. One is a lot more freedom and flexibility, because if you go back to pre-industrial times, most people were paid for their output. If you were a miller or a baker or a blacksmith or something like that, people paid you for what you did. And in the Industrial Revolution, we switched to most people getting paid for their time. And in order to make that practical, everyone had to work at the same time. So everyone has to get to work at 8 a.m. and leave at 5 or whatever it is. And I think some of our ancestors at least would have thought that that's a terrible, like a tyranny to have to be to someone else to choose the hours that you work. So I think we'll get a lot more flexibility that way. And this is the part that I think is much harder to imagine. A real drop in commercial real estate values, and there's already some pressure, but hasn't collapsed or anything like that. And a lessening of the traffic into the city centers has a huge number of ramifications, for deurbanization, for a loss of utilization of public transit, for the health of the businesses that are there to serve the office workers. And I'm a believer in markets, so I think that we'll figure out collectively how to deal with those challenges. But I think because it'll be very disruptive, there'll definitely be some people who lose out in those transitions. And I don't think this is likely, but I think there's a little part of my brain that's worried, especially in the US, that we go further down this automobile-dependent, suburbanized, spread out world, and away from the vibrant city centers. But they're not just vibrant; they're ecologically and environmentally superior. They're the places where artists find each other and movements start, and all of this creativity. And that's a little bit of a concern for me.
Okay. Just a yes or no question. Is there still this kind of CEO Thursdays therapy group, your Zoom call with? It's still there.
Still there.
And you talk about how you manage, how you survive the pandemic with your team and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean everything from. Lately, there's been a lot of talk about communications to employees about the election and dealing with employee concerns there. But it can be everything from marketing to what are you seeing in different parts of the world, and I mean just everything that comes up. So I think all of us, like everyone, are confronted with a lot more uncertainty than is typical. And it's very helpful to have peers that you can talk to about that stuff.
We have to talk about a strange thing. At the end, so you are at the core of this explosion of remote work, and you're gaining a lot of customers these days. And despite this fact, your stock price is not doing really well. So I think you are one of the few stocks that didn't profit from the pandemic. How come?
I think we just need a little bit more time. I think we're poorly understood because we're very different than most enterprise software companies. We have 130,000 customers, and they're distributed all over the world.
So you mean by customers, you mean companies?
Companies, yes. So there's millions and millions of people at those companies. Some of them are, there's hundreds of thousands of users. Our biggest deployment ever was a little while ago to Amazon for 450,000 people, and IBM has 350,000, and there's many companies that have 100,000. So small businesses are disproportionately impacted, or maybe a better way to say it, they're impacted more directly by macroeconomic changes. So in other words, they're more likely to go out of business than big companies. They're more likely to stop hiring than big companies, more likely to have to lay employees off than big companies. And although it happens with big companies too. So the way that our business is set up, when customers experience pain, we experience that pain because we are so confident about the value of Slack that we charge on actual usage. So if someone stops using Slack, you just automatically get a refund for the amount that you prepaid, and your bill is lower the next month. But if you add people, the opposite is true. So the number that we published last quarter was lower than some people would have expected, but it's a net number. So the growth, I think, in the background is much stronger. Now that we're past the worst of that, let's say I look forward to publishing our next quarterly results. There's been a narrative since we've been public that Microsoft is going to crush us at any moment.
Will Microsoft crush you?
Well, it's been 16 quarters that we've been competing with them. Almost our whole existence, Microsoft Teams has been given away for free.
So there's Teams. It's like inspired by Slack, you can say. It's also a kind of corporate chat client.
I think it's actually evolved quite a bit since the beginning, but the very first versions were, they say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So they were very flattering. That's it.
Okay. And now it's also kind of Zoom.
I think the
environment and
Microsoft had as part of the Office 365 suite a product called Skype for Business. So it is not the normal Skype, but it's the thing that used to be called Microsoft Link, and before that, Microsoft Communicator. That got shut down, and all of the usage incorporated into Teams, which meant that they suddenly had 100 million people who used to use Skype for video conferencing and now use Teams, and it's. I'd say Slack has not done a great job in clearly articulating an answer to the question, what is Slack and why is it important over the years? We're still figuring that out. But people can only fit so much in their head at one time. And I think that in the long run, to the extent that people view Teams principally as a video conferencing tool, they won't see the possibilities in it that people experience in Slack. Like the reason that people use Slack is very different than the reason that people use Teams. It's important to Microsoft that that we not be very successful. I mean, I think they still view us as kind of an existential threat, despite the fact that they're orders of magnitude bigger. And the best tactic they've had is confusing people about, if you have Teams, you don't need Slack. If you like Slack, you should use Teams instead because it's the same thing, but it's free. And the reality is they're not at all the same thing. And I could go into the many reasons for that, but I think that would be a little bit boring.
Okay. So give me just in theory, my IT department is approaching me and telling me, Jochen, you use this Slack thing, but we have this new company contract with Microsoft Office, and it's all in there. You have Teams, and it solves all your problems. You don't need Zoom, and you don't need Slack anymore. So what do I tell them?
Wow. I mean, it depends on your relationship with them, I guess.
60 seconds.
Yeah. one of my favorite ways of saying is often you can get a puppy for free. It doesn't mean that the puppy is actually free. I mean, there's a total cost of ownership, but the more important thing is every organization, nonprofit, government, corporate, social, political, every single organization has as their principal challenge the achievement of alignment across the people, clarity of objectives and clarity of roles and all of that. It's critically important to the success. Whether it's free or it costs 25 euro cents a day per employee is really irrelevant if it's at all helpful in achieving that. So it would be, in English, penny wise, pound foolish to make that choice.
Last question.
Okay.
I met you, I think, 15 years ago for the first time. And I remember you, and you still are a really, as I mentioned before, you're also a really playful person. You have a lot of ideas. Now you seem to be a little bit more CEO-like. How do you keep yourself being playful and having your ideas kicking around new stuff? How do you do that? Is there a routine in your CEO day?
I'm terrible at time management, terrible at routines. So one part of it is covered by just staying up very late after everyone has gone to sleep. And I know that no one will message me anything and no one's expecting anything of me. Then I can really think. But the other thing is I've started playing music a lot more. I stopped playing music for 15 or 20 years, and it's a great creative outlet because obviously public company CEO is a more constrained role in some respects than freewheeling, disruptive entrepreneur.
Stewart, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you to the audience.
Yeah.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.